design thinking is a way of describing the collection of mindsets and tool sets that creative people, that designers have accumulated over time to tackle the kinds of challenges that they've traditionally faced. But then with the idea that we can then apply those mindsets and tool sets to a broader set of problems.
Welcome to the Diff.
You've got some way to get manufacturer support for your device, that's great. But when that support ends, that's usually the day that your phone breaks. And if the manufacturer doesn't provide any sort of manual or system for you to economically get it repaired, that's when we come in. And so at that point, if it's broken and it's out of warranty, you've literally got nothing to lose. And we encourage you to open it up and try and fix it.
Biomimicry is just doing the same thing, but looking back even further and looking to the natural world and asking that question of, well, what is the fundamental challenge or function we're trying to solve for, and are there analogies in the natural world, and what can we learn from how that problem has been solved through adaptation and evolution, and translate that into a design innovation for people.
Living systems have been around for a few billion years and will be around for many more. In the living world, there's no landfill. Instead, materials flow. One species' waste is another's food, energy is provided by the sun, things grow, then die, and nutrients return to the soil safely. And it works. Yet as humans, we've adopted a linear approach. We take, we make, and we dispose. A new phone comes out, so we ditch the old one. Our washing machine packs up, so we buy another. Each time we do this, we're eating into a finite supply of resources and often producing toxic waste. It simply can't work long term. So what can? If we accept that the living world's cyclical model works, can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle. How can our waste build capital rather than reduce it? By rethinking and redesigning products and components, and the packaging they come in, we can create safe and compostable materials that help grow more stuff. As they say in the movies, no resources have been lost in the making of this material. So what about the washing machines, mobile phones, fridges? We know they don't biodegrade. Here, we're talking about another sort of rethink, a way to cycle valuable metals, polymers, and alloys so they maintain their quality and continue to be useful beyond the shelf life of individual products. What if the goods of today became the resources of tomorrow? It makes commercial sense. Instead of the throw away and replace culture we've become used to, we'd adopt a return and renew one, where products and components are designed to be disassembled and regenerated. One solution may be to rethink the way we view ownership. What if we never actually owned our technologies? We simply licensed them from the manufacturers. Now, let's put these two cycles together. Imagine if we could design products to come back to their makers, their technical materials being reused and their biological parts increasing agricultural value. And imagine that these products are made and transported using renewable energy. Here we have a model that builds prosperity long term. And the good news is, there are already companies out there who are beginning to adopt this way of working. But the circular economy isn't about one manufacturer changing one product. It's about all the interconnecting companies that form our infrastructure and economy coming together. It's about energy. It's about rethinking the operating system itself. We have a fantastic opportunity to open new perspectives and new horizons. Instead of remaining trapped in the frustrations of the present, with creativity and innovation, we really can rethink and redesign our future.
A hackathon is basically
a really cramped period of time where you
Hey,
get
Scott,
all
just to let
sorts
you know,
of
we've got
minds
like,
together.
7 minutes
how you
left
might
and then we'll be live.
prototype new ideas which relate to
So
how
you just to
resources are used,
reiterate
how
a little
manufacturers
intro
do their
and then your
job,
introduction and then you can
about how
unmute yourself.
items are designed.
they have to work for 48
Great.
hours to
Cheers.
develop a prototype.
So we're trying to come up with a little avatar person.
We have a location going on at MIT, the USA, at NID in India, at Cranfield University in the UK.
We're team Boom Hackalacka.
We've gotten different teams to focus on different local aspects of it to actually come up with new solutions.
We're trying to alleviate the pressure on the NHS.
We aim to extend the lives of batteries
using circular economy principles.
It's amazing the amount of innovation you can produce in 2 days.
Plastics are all around us. We all benefit from them. They help make our cars lighter, protect our food and insulate our homes. As we use plastics in more and more ways, we're also creating more. But did you know that just 14% of global plastic packaging is recycled? All the rest, worth $80 to $120 billion every year, is lost after just one short use. And that nearly a third of all plastic packaging leaks into ecosystems where it can stay around for hundreds of years. This means that by 2050, there could be more plastics than fish in the sea. The new plastics economy aims to drive a movement towards a system that works, transforming the current take, make, dispose economy into one where plastics are designed to be used over and over again. To do that, we're bringing together leading organisations, experts and entrepreneurs from across the world to innovate, collaborate and rethink the way we produce, use and recover plastics. We know it's possible. Join us in creating an effective system that works for everyone. Visit newplasticseconomy.org to learn more and see who's already involved.
Hey, my name is Seb and I help to manage the social media here at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. While you're waiting, why not join us on Twitter and Instagram using #ThinkDiff. Ask your latest pressing questions on Twitter and send us some photos of yourself watching your favourite Diff sessions. And don't forget, you can get all the latest updates and join the discussion in the Diffs Cafe. Right now, why don't you find out about the Diffs headliners?
Hello, I'm Becky and I manage the Diff headliners. For 2016, we've got Paul Mason, Robert Scoble, Nikki Silvestri, Sir Ken Robinson and Dr. Peter Senge, and Douglas Rushkoff. And if you miss any of them, don't forget to look at the catch-up on the Diff highlights page.
Hi, I'm Molly. And I'm Karen. We hunted globally for designers, innovators, entrepreneurs, and academics who all wanted to contribute to the conversation.
The aim of the open mic stage is to provide a platform for important ideas and emerging trends to be shared and discussed.
When organizing your calendar, look for open mics in blue.
Hi, my name is Leo, and for the last few months I've been working with universities within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Higher Education Network to put together our Big Top 10 events. Look for the green events in our schedule.
Hi, I'm Colin and I've been helping to put together this live stream studio, and we'll be using this studio throughout the 3 weeks of the Diff because we've lined up a whole range of fascinating guests and we'll be broadcasting from right here throughout.
Hi, I'm Emma, and we're not just recording live from the studio in Kouskolen, we're also recording the Higher Education Day live from Delft University of Technology. Across 7 sessions, we will be exploring the role of higher education in shaping the future economy. Talking about sessions, aren't you supposed to be recording right now?
Welcome to the Diff.
Some people get intrigued about how I see the next step. I do not see anything. The nature tells me what to do. What I am an observer. I believe that the farther you want to go, the less things you have to take with yourself. That's what I do. I develop a technology, I profit from it, and then I go to the next one.
Stories are data with a soul. Today we're going to talk about framing, mental structures that shape the way that we see the world. Hi, and welcome at the Diff. My name is Emma Fromberg, and today with me on the sofa I have Ken Webster, Head of Innovation of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and author of the book A Wealth of Flows. Welcome, Ken.
Oh, welcome, Emma. Yeah.
And online with me I have Scott London, a California-based author, researcher and consultant. You might also know him as a former radio presenter, known for his interviews with leading writers and thinkers. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
Framing. What is it? What is it not? And why is it important?
Well, hi, everybody. Framing from my vantage point is critically important. I'm here in California where we are just, all of us, still in a state of shock about the presidential election that just passed. And for a lot of us, one of the things that we're beginning to recognize in hindsight is that framing had a whole lot to do with the political messages that have just come at us over the last year and a half, and that framing had a big part of not just the election, but part of the reason why we are in such a state of shock here is we didn't realize just how many of us were operating on the assumption that we shared a similar frame of what the problem was in America. So framing is very much a timely subject for us here in the States.
And Ken, do you have any examples how we use frames in economics?
Well, I'm sure Scott could tell us a bit more about the frames which have been operating in the political arena in a moment, but I just wanted to illustrate just a couple of examples from economics about how powerful they can be. And I'll just take one. Let's take a notion, again, it originated in the United States, the use of the phrase tax relief. When people talk about taxes and you put the word relief with it, well, why do people need relief? Because they're being oppressed. They need rescuing. They need somebody to come and rescue them. In a way, they need relief from pain or whatever it is. And if you put that with the word tax, it makes tax sound that it's all about oppression, all about limiting what goes on, when in fact you could look at tax in a different way. You could say, well, taxes are sort of a payment for things that we get in common, things that we share. So activating the notion of a tax relief is a way of saying that you should have a particular view of how taxes, or what the meaning of taxes are. Another one which is very durable and very relevant too to today's sort of discussion is the idea that the government is like a household. Everybody's experiences households and they all have a budget. And you only have to spend so much, or you have to go into credit and whatever. So there's the idea that it's constrained, the household's constrained. But actually a government, if they own their own currency, you know, if they can print their own money, they can create their own credit, they're not like a household, they're like a bank. So to treat the government like a household and put on it constraints about what it can do in the way of creating money, it can create money for nothing and spend it into existence. It doesn't even have to borrow it if it doesn't want to. But people have got this idea, oh no, the government's like a household, it's only got so much money. So there's an example of a very durable framing. And then perhaps the last one to bring out is this idea that people are selfish. Well, yes, sure, there's a part of an argument to say that people have a selfish side, but in many of the studies that have been done about behavior, people have an altruistic side as well as a selfish one. So to make assumptions about how, say, markets work and people are always there selfishly getting their interests served, that's not true. A lot of people operate in a much more, should we call it, generous way. And these are just three examples of some of the ways we've got very concise frames which limit discussion. Just on that.
They're also very unconscious.
Well, this is the big thing. I'm sure Scott, I'd really like Scott to come back on that, and I'm fascinated with your take on the political framing that's happened in the last year and a half. But they're very concise because it's about the unconscious reaction to words. Everything we say has a sort of, all abstract thought is metaphorical. Everything we say has images attached to it and perceptions. And this describes how we would react to that word.
And Scott, could you please react on this? Is framing a way that we can unconsciously also manipulate people, or is it something else?
Well, the way that I understand framing, and the reason why it's so important to understand when we're talking about complex ideas like economic systems and political systems, democracy, how we get together collectively to address really serious issues like climate change, poverty, immigration, difficult global issues that we really can't understand without invoking frames. This is the thing that's so difficult about them, is that each of us comes to these ideas and issues with frames already in place. These are frames that are largely unquestioned sets of assumptions that we have about the nature of the world and about reality itself. And they're structures by which we interpret ideas and information. Now, the thing about frames that's so tricky is that they're largely unconscious. They're these mental structures that are deeply resistant to new ideas and information. That's the thing, so that you can't educate or change somebody's frame just by giving them better information or new information. It's very difficult to remove the existing frames that people already have in place because they're deeply embedded in our consciousness. And so that's part of the reason why framing is such an interesting art and an interesting science, because the act of framing involves recognizing that people already have frameworks in place and then working with existing frameworks to try to shift them. And that's a big challenge, but it's possible to do.
So framing is like the wiring of your brain, your neurological pathways that you establish throughout your life. And Scott,
Exactly.
can you elaborate on how can you use those neurological pathways to bring in new ideas?
Well, this is the interesting thing, is that frames are a mark of intelligence. We're human, and part of our intelligence is always looking for shortcuts to understanding so that we can interpret more information and more data. So a frame is actually a really good thing. It allows us to quickly sort of size up a situation, understand what it's about, and then assess what needs to be done. So frameworks are very helpful, except when they get to be unhelpful, when they're no longer useful, when we're operating according to old ideas or old ways of thinking that prevent us from taking the next logical step in our evolution, in the evolution of our thinking, and innovating, being creative, finding new and better solutions to problems. And that's where our old frameworks really get in the way. So working with the mental circuitry and sort of reframing something is critically important, but it isn't just about packaging ideas or spinning a new message or advertising or doing PR. It's much more basic than that, and it really involves working together with other people to bring unexamined assumptions into the open.
Do you think that's really important? If I can just jump in there, Emma, is that all right? That you've got to surface a new idea before you can really start to work on the framing issues, because it's almost as if you're saying some things are just not visible in our discourse. Do you have any examples of that, or do you have any further thoughts about that? The idea of you have to surface something first before you can work on positioning it better.
Well, part of the difficulty is that we're operating within bubbles, increasingly now with the power of the internet, which brings so many people together across boundaries, geographic boundaries, time boundaries. Here we are having this conversation. I'm in California, you're in England. And so we're straddling, vast distances, and we're able to come together in such a way that it makes it appear that we're all speaking the same language, when in fact, many of us are operating according to very different frameworks. Frames of understanding. That is what a frame is, by the way. If I were to define it, I would say a frame is short for a frame of reference. And it's a similar thing to a metaphor or a paradigm. The difference between a frame and a metaphor, or a frame and a paradigm, let's say, is that frames are based on values. They're very deep-seated. They have an element of morality based in. Morality means simply that ideas of what is right and wrong are built into frameworks. And this is the reason why it's very difficult to work with people in other cultures, for example, who are operating according to different frames of reference. Or even just, if you look at some of the conflicts that we have here in the United States around issues of right and wrong, so many Americans still are wedded to a very Christian view, that's somewhat fundamentalist view, that individuals are inherently bad and that they need to be taught how to be good. That's a frame. And it suggests that those people are interpreting ideas and information in one way, whereas those of us who think that human beings are inherently good, that we're all here to learn how to become better and to solve our problems, together, though we see things differently. That's the thing. If you have an assumption that human beings are inherently bad, that we're sinful creatures and we need strict rules of conduct to allow us to be the best that we can be, then with that comes the assumption that an authority figure or a public institution like a religious organization is the best way to teach people how to be good. Implicit in that is authority, because if I'm not good enough to know what's best for myself, then I have to rely on an authority to tell me and to let me know what that way is. So that's just an example of a framework and how it can really get tricky when you begin to search for common solutions to things, because people are coming at it from very different assumptions and frames of reference.
And Ken, you wrote the book A Wealth of Flows. You have been focusing on this new idea of a circular economy, and you've been looking at new ways to frame this new idea. Can you give an example of how you use that in your book?
Not everything's new. It's about perhaps how it's repositioned or reworked. But just as Scott was talking about the contrast, I think it's back to Lakoff, isn't it, about the idea that the nation is a family, and whether it's dominated by a strict father or a hierarchical structure, or whether it's the more inclusive, nurturing family that we're thinking about. With economics, you've got this idea that the world is like a mechanism. It's like a machine world. It's very much predictable. You can understand, predict, and control the world. And when you look at words around markets, it's all about, price is determined by the interaction of supply and demand. It's almost like the market becomes the authority figure because it determines what the answer is. You want the most efficient use of resources? Run it through the market machine and you'll get an answer. There's no worry about that because it's deterministic. So that's the idea of a machine economy. And even the economics that's still studied is very largely the idea that it's almost like the economy is a clockwork. Somebody said it's a bit like a rocking horse, if you don't use another analogy, that it's always going to be in equilibrium. It's always going to settle down after it's suffered from some shocks. If only you leave it alone to the market to make every decision.
What would be a better frame for
Well, a better frame for that, well, if you just use that one, let's say that the economy is like a herd of wild horses, right? So you get a very different idea about what managing the economy will be like if you saw it as a herd of wild horses. It needs maneuvering in a way which is very sensitive to what the interactions are. But we talk about in the Wealth of Flows more the idea that it takes insights from living systems. And an American businessman, Nick Hanauer, often talks about changing the mechanical idea of a market to one where he's talking more about gardens and how you've got to make sure that the soil is right and how some things work in this place, but you might have to move it to that one. It's much more of a gardening analogy for how these systems work, taking insights from living systems. Or the other one is the idea, if you want to feed a tree, you feed the forest. In other words, everybody can be better off when everybody is better off because there's these connections. So these are very different positionings, but we tend to talk about keeping up with contemporary science, which shows that most real-world systems are full of feedback. They're feedback rich. They're not like mechanical systems. So the economy is also likely to be complex and adaptive and behaves more like a herd of wild horses than it does a machine. Because a little study I read lately said that in one speech from the Federal Reserve, we're using as American examples, the head of that organization mentioned equilibrium 22 times in a 45-minute speech. So that's really saying the economy is a machine. It will get back to being okay eventually. But if you have a more living systems or a fluid systems idea, it'll be perhaps stable for a while, but it's never going to settle to an equilibrium. You've got to continually intervene to make sure it's responsive to what the participants in the economy require. So this is just a very different way of looking at it. And I think in a way it reflects both good and bad on our current situation, because we still tend to, it's almost like we've got 19th century economics, 20th century business models, but now a 21st century information structure, which, as you were saying, Scott, we're benefiting from because we can dialogue across here. So
century problems.
Yeah, that's right. 21st century problems. And so we have to have the mental tools and able to be able to approach this properly. And one of the, perhaps the big mistakes is to keep looking at the economy as though it was a machine that corrects itself. And that's far too crude. It's just crude. It's not entirely wrong, but we can look at it in a more sophisticated way these days. I don't know what you think, Scott, about the...
Well, this is a subject that actually has fascinated me for some time, because if we go back to the Enlightenment from about 400 or 500 years ago, we started to do away with the idea that the universe was created by God, the omniscient creator, and we started to discover the power of science to understand how the universe is operated. But the great Enlightenment thinkers didn't do away with the idea of God. There was still a creator, but within that creator, he created this array of mechanisms, you know, these things, these processes in nature and in the world that operated sort of like machines. But over time, as the Enlightenment sort of began to pick up steam and as our scientific method became more precise, we kind of did away with the idea of God altogether. The trouble is that we couldn't really reconcile the idea of a universe without a creator, because who's going to create the machines? And so we came up with a lot of kind of crazy ideas, like the whole idea of randomness. And there were some very harebrained theories about how this was supposed to happen. You know, if you have a whirlwind in a junkyard, eventually over time, you know, enough of the pieces will sort of begin to assemble themselves and you can get an airplane just through random mutation. These ideas that if you lack a creator, that somehow the random universe will somehow still create these great machines. But the trouble with this idea is that we don't really have a way of understanding machinery and mechanisms when things begin to break down. We don't have an alternative cosmology that can help us to understand how things can come back together, how things can grow, how things can evolve on their own without either God or without some sort of random accident, which is the theories based on Cartesian science. So, but in I would say the last maybe generation or two, there are a lot of emerging theories in science which are very promising and very exciting, because they suggest the whole idea of living systems, of self-organizing systems, of inherent, there's a term in science called autopoiesis, which suggests the idea that there is a kind of a self-renewing aspect to nature and to the world that we can see in many living systems. And it's perfectly consistent with science, but it doesn't fall back on that whole idea of mechanics, you know, that everything is a machine that eventually is going to run down. And we have to try to maximize the returns while we can before it breaks down. So I'm very, very excited about some of these new ideas in sciences, because they give us different metaphors, different paradigms for understanding that things can come together and self-organize in ways that are actually very conducive to life, to growth, and to renewal, without having to rely on these old paradigms and metaphors.
Yeah, but what a task it is to shift that general perception, or the general perceptions. And it's, in a way, I suppose we should really talk a bit about education, because you could argue that the education systems we have now are really also stuck in the 19th century with their narrow silos and their focus on perhaps one form of measurement. And do you have any thoughts about that, Scott?
We actually also have a short video on that, yeah, by George Lakoff.
All right, so let's go to the...
Shall we broadcast that one, and then we will react on that after?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Good.
It has to do with the notion of rationality itself. And this is important. If you are a conservative and you go to college, you probably study business and you'll take a course in marketing. And marketing professors study cognitive science, my field. They study how people really think in terms of metaphors, narratives, unconscious thought, emotions, and so on. That is the way real human thought works. And language evokes those things. So they will talk in terms of that, and people who run conservative operations know this very well. If you're a progressive and you try to go into public life, you'll study political science, law, public policy, and economics. In those cases, they don't teach you how people really think. They don't teach you about frames, metaphors, emotional reasoning, narrative structure, and so on. They teach you basically what's called the rational actor model and Enlightenment reason. Enlightenment reason comes from Descartes in 1650, and it says that thought is disembodied, that it's logic, it works by logical reasoning, not by frames. Frames have a logic. All these things have logics. Metaphors have logics, but they don't work by the way mathematicians do logic. They work in other terms in terms of their own human logics. And then there's an assumption that we have reason in order to maximize our interests. So you get a theory in economics called the rational actor model, which tells you should be using game theory to always maximize your profit. And this is always done in terms of numbers as if everything were money. So you're maximizing profit all the time. And a lot of progressives think in terms of that. And as a result, they tell people the facts. They say, okay, we're going to tell you, we're going to divide things up issue by issue. There's an issue about the economy, which is different from global warming, et cetera. And now we're going to teach you all the facts about it, one by one, as if the facts were separate from each other. And they're not. And as if the facts could be understood just in terms of logic, but not in terms of the way that they interact systemically, unconsciously, in the way you think, right? This is part of our educational system. Progressives are miseducated about what reason is.
That was a short clip of the previous DIF's session about framing. We have a question in from the audience. Verena Vermeulen asks, how can and do you want to change frameworks of people who have wrong presumptions, like about the economy, within their frameworks? Do you think we should all be educated about our frameworks so we don't get stuck in our old ones? And how can we be able to communicate to other people and cultures better in this way? Scott, do you briefly want to react on this question?
Well, it sounds to me like maybe there are three questions there, all in one. So I will say that do people's frames need to be adjusted? Do we need to change people's frameworks so that they work better? That's the first question from my understanding. And I think this is one of the interesting things, which is it's not really possible to do that. It's not possible to act on other people by sort of insisting on your framework as better than theirs. I have seen many problems with this. Politicians try it, educators try it, the media tries it, and we're just not very good at doing that. If we were, maybe we wouldn't have voted Trump into office here in the States. So I don't think that you can really sort of go in and kind of, through an act of manipulation, change another person's point of view. This is something that people have to come to on their own, but what we can do is we can craft our messages so that they better respond to frameworks that are already in place, the frameworks that people already have. And that's something that I actually do as a consultant with organizations. So there are many different ways of doing that, but that's totally possible to do. And I think that also gets to the other part of that question, which is, how do you do that? And I think that it's done through dialogue and through being very clear in your understanding of how other people understand an issue, so that you can get the differences of opinion and the multiplicity of views on an issue out into the open. That's always the first step.
And do you believe we should teach those framing skills and the mastering of framing to students in different disciplines?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a little bit like, I think of framing as the 21st century equivalent of media literacy, or even of critical thinking. It's an essential capacity that we should all have. But in order to begin to do that, we have to recognize that frames are there. Many of us don't even know what a framework is. We don't even know what it is. It's still something that a relatively small number of people are talking about.
And do you think that it also brings a certain responsibility if you master the skill of good framing and you understand how this wiring of neurological pathways works in the brain?
The way that the wiring works in the neurological pathways in the brain makes it sound more complex than it is. It's actually not that complex. All of us are operating according to unexamined frames of reference. And just that alone, if we could all sort of embrace that and understand that, we could begin to talk to one another more easily. So it doesn't have to be that complicated.
And Ken, would you like to react on this? You do a lot of work with education.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree with Scott, though it might make it more interesting if I chose to disagree. But I think one thing I would be slightly like to throw into the mix is that I think it's again Lakoff who says that only if you are offering a better frame will people consider shifting across. Some people won't shift at all. Their frameworks are unexamined and not shiftable, but other people have, maybe they're operating inconsistently. They have different frameworks for different issues. And so sometimes you can help shape up a framework which is perhaps not so strongly held. You can not by telling them, but by helping them think it through and offering them a better way of understanding. I quite agree with Scott. You're not going to be able to you can't go and teach people a different frame, but what you can do is you can tempt them, because what they want to do is have a better shortcut in their minds to identifying what is going on. And if you can make that suggestion good, here's a good one. You say, we talked about tax before. Now, if I talked about the idea that we should have resource use fees for using resources which are held in common, like copper ore or other things, that doesn't sound half as bad as saying we need to tax non-renewables, because taxing sounds, oh, that's bad, we don't want that at all. Whereas we say there's a resource use fee, because if you want to use it and you didn't create it, after all, it's not your copper, it's merely there in the earth, you've got the right to take it out, but you don't, you didn't create it. So paying a resource use fee sounds a reasonable thing to charge people for, you see, and that makes a whole difference. So they go, yeah, I can go with resource use fees because we're not talking tax. I think it can almost be as simple as that. You go, oh yeah, that'd be good. So we have resource use fees on that, and we'll take away taxes on income. Oh, they quite like that relationship there, because they can see a benefit because you're fitting their frame of reducing taxes, and it appeals to their sense of fairness, considering this is not a private wealth, it's provided by the planet, if you like, to pay a fee for the use of it. So that would be an example for me about trying to nudge the framing over, because you don't try and defeat their idea of tax. You say, let's play to that on one side, but reposition where the income is coming from by calling it a resource use fee.
Yeah, so you actually bridge two different paradigms.
Well, maybe not as grand as that, but at least you're integrating their thinking without having to threaten them by saying, we've got to tax non-renewables.
And is that because it's more grounded in their values?
Well, they think taxes are taken and never applied to anything that they might believe in, or not much. Whereas a resource use fee sounds like, well, we're helping to conserve resources and it's only fair anyway, and I'm not going to pay it because it will be the people who dig it out of the ground who probably pay it. So they have that sense that it's a just thing to do, particularly if you tie it with reducing their personal burden of tax, you see. So that's an attempt to reposition things without, you're not trying different paradigms so much as just trying to connect what they think they should pay for and what they don't like paying for. Anyway, that's an example.
We are going to have a really short break because Joe Miller, my co-worker here on the foundation, and also my wonderful desk neighbor, is going to explain a few more sessions that will come up today, but also the rest of the diff. She will elaborate on the sessions that she wants to see during the diff. And there she goes.
Hi, thank you, Emma, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So kind of what we're seeing here is the value of framing in being able to shape our understanding of how we see the world. And this often finds resonance in different languages through the cultural words and metaphors that we have. So here at the Disruptive Innovation Festival, we have a whole series of sessions in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and a smattering of other languages as well. For our French participants and spectators, we've got 5 sessions that you can catch up on yesterday, and throughout the rest of the week we've got a number of other sessions in these different languages, so that, as Scott was pointing out, we can have these discussions and dialogues in different cultural and economic contexts. So coming up, something completely different this afternoon. We've got the second of 2 podcasts run by the Arizona State University and their Future Innovation Society around the risks of circular economy. They're hoping to assimilate the questions that come out of these 5 podcasts into a final podcast at the end of the week. So if you'd like to be part of that and contribute your questions, then tune in later on this afternoon. And if tomatoes are your thing, then join us first thing on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, when you'll be able to find out how this humble little red fruit was able to become the hero of a complex industrial challenge. And that's first thing on Monday. So don't forget, you really should have a diff, join in, have a My Diff account so that you can find out all the latest about what's going on for the next couple of weeks. Remember diff.co for all the schedule and program information, and hashtag ThinkDiff to be able to share your thoughts, pictures and ideas about what's going on. So I'm going to hand you back to Emma, because this is an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Scott and Ken have got to say over the next half an hour. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. Sorry for that. We had a few technical issues. We got a really good question in from somebody at the office that also talked to you, Scott, before this session. And it says, Scott, you told us that the most effective frames are those who speak to universal ideals and aspirations, such as freedom, security, and fairness. Democracy is an idea that embodies these values. And considering how popular democracy is, but how badly it's done in practice sometimes, why does this idea remain so important, and how come people ignore how it works in practice? Scott.
Right, well, let's see, where do I begin to address that? I think that on the one hand, there are 2 different subjects that we're talking and exploring here. One is frames, which are like paradigms or like metaphors, and the other is the act of framing, which is really different. They're frames that operate already, that exist, that we all use and make, and that we all sort of rely on to interpret ideas and information. Frames already exist. Then there's framing, which is really about establishing a new frame or trying to activate maybe a different frame in the minds of other people. And that's something that, whether we're in the media or in politics or in an organization like yours, this is something that we have to actively do and think about. So how do we frame our message? And that's a little different. When we get to actively seeking better frames, when we're working to create better frameworks, that's when it becomes very important to always activate the key values that we all share as human beings, because values underlie all of our frameworks, whether they're freedom, security, human dignity, whatever the core value is, our frameworks at bottom are rooted in those key values and ideals, the things that we hold valuable. And so when you talk about framing, you absolutely have to invoke those key values so that people have a shared reference about what the underlying purpose is.
Thank you. Do you want to react on that, Ken?
Yeah, I do in a way, because it might, that question might reflect for me how much we're not able to shift some ideas. Because paradoxically, you'd think, well, we need to reinvestigate democracy if it's not really working out too well. But somehow people are happy to carry with them the idea it's not working too well at the moment, with the idea that it is what we really want, but not necessarily get involved in trying to shift it too much, because they're sort of satisfied, oh, I got a vote, I got a chance to say something. And yet behind the scene, all sorts of different maneuvers are going on, which leave the population thinking, we're very important, we've got a role in this, but actually they don't look at it deeply enough that they're almost easily satisfied that they did something, when power might operate in a more complex and difficult to understand way. So we get trapped in a way by saying, well, at least I could do this, and that's good. Well, I agree it's good, but that isn't the end of the story, is it, with democracy?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how positive people are towards democracy when you see how it sometimes, and sometimes quite often, has quite negative consequences for people. And you would say that if you would walk that pathway of negative consequences often enough, it would also be framed in their minds, right? So Scott, why do you think that people are so positive again, like towards democracy, while it actually often has negative consequences?
Well, you know the old line about how democracy is the best system of government, except for all the others. And so I think that we love democracy because the alternative is almost unthinkable, especially for those of us who've been raised to think that, you know, all of us are created as equals, that we all have basic human rights, and that we all have a voice in shaping the essential policies that we're going to live by. So democracy is a wonderful idea. The trouble is that we really haven't perfected it in practice. Too much of the democracy we have around the world is democracy in name only. We actually have dictatorships, or we have very strong authority figures that operate in the name of democracy, but actually we don't have that much power as citizens and as individuals. And so I think that a lot of what we're seeing throughout Europe right now, and especially in this country, is a reaction to the fact that the democracy that we have isn't working. It's not that democracy is bad, it's that the system that we have doesn't reflect the ideals of democracy. And so that's it's a very important question. It's not that democracy is the problem. The problem is that we don't actually have enough democracy, as I see it.
Yeah, the cure to inadequacies is more of it, in a sense. We have to get more democracy to cure the problems that we've got in it at the moment. Yes, that's interesting, and I probably, well, certainly would agree with that. I'm wondering what you think probably one of the biggest frames we've got to, or framing problems we've got to address is, you know, just reflecting on your long career, looking at this, what do you think has been some of the most inappropriate or difficult to deal with framing issues? What do you keep coming across, and how do you work with that? You know, you've talked about surfacing things, making sure people realize how they're thinking, but what seems to be one of the big sticking points for you, if I can ask that question directly, yeah?
Well, an issue that I've worked on quite a bit in recent years is climate change. I think that climate change is is sort of the mother of all global problems right now. And the fact that we're having such trouble figuring out how to address it is really, I mean, it's the quintessential 21st century problem. And the fact that we now have elected a president who doesn't even acknowledge that it's happening is beyond worrisome. It's shocking. And I think that all of us who've been working on this issue for a long time, are justifiably pretty worried right now. So that's one issue. Climate change part of the reason why it hasn't had more traction, why people aren't able to address it more readily, and why there's still such a culture of denialism, is because it activates old frames of reference that I think people have not questioned. And scientists have tried, using their best data and their most persuasive techniques to try to change people's view on this, but they haven't succeeded. And so it's a really interesting case study of how framing works and how it doesn't work. New ideas and information are not enough to change the frameworks that people hold.
Is there also a question about indirect causation there? We were mentioning this, that because it's what's happening in a system, you can't make the direct connection between a flood in New York and climate change. Any particular event seems to be just an event and is not, Lakoff again calls it systemic causation. There's no real sense of the connection, and it can always be denied if they can't see it one-to-one,
Right.
They don't take it up, do they? I mean, they don't take up that systemic understanding.
And also there's the assumption that we trust the media or that we trust politicians, just in the same way that there's an assumption that the broad culture sort of accepts what the media says is true, is really under fire right now. And I think that also extends to scientists. A lot of people, the public at large, don't necessarily trust scientists to have their best interests in mind. So there's a real reaction, especially in this culture, to climate scientists who keep on telling them that they're thinking wrong. And there's a defiance in the culture that says, well, who are you to say that I'm thinking wrong? You see? And this is this feeling of being acted upon by experts, which is very, very deep in the culture right now. And it's happening not just here in the US, but in many parts of the world.
Indeed, you're
So
right.
this is part of the trouble, is that we have so many people telling us what we're supposed to think. And so that activates a frame that says, no, I'm going to use what little power I have to reshape the debate, in this case by electing somebody who thinks that what you're saying isn't true.
Yeah.
I just want to have one more question in from the audience. So from MWL, how can one discover the limits of their framing, and how can they change their own frame? Scott, can I give this question to you?
Yes, well, one of the things that I love to do is get together with groups of people who are diverse and think differently. You can do this. My screen just went dark, sorry. You can do this in a number of ways. One of the most popular is through focus groups, where you actually literally handpick people who have different values and ideas and perspectives. But you can also just bring together a diverse group, a cross-section of people in a community for a dialogue. And one of the things that happens almost automatically when people bring their different views on a subject into the open is that they begin to realize the limits of their own thinking. It's a shocking thing how it happens, but it's actually very satisfying, not just to witness, but also to have happen when it happens to me. Sometimes when I'm confronted by somebody else's point of view that differs from my own, it doesn't necessarily change what I think, but it enlarges what I think. And so that's a very powerful way to begin to recognize that the frames that we have are limited. They're inadequate.
In uncertain economic times, shall we say, do you think that people are not encouraged to think more broadly, paradoxically, because they're so full of anxiety, focusing on the immediate day-to-day things? How do I get some more money in for these bills or whatever? And I wonder if this plays into the problem that, in a way, somebody said that democracy needs people to be comfortable, to let them have the time to think, to get involved in civic life, and an economy full of uncertainty and I'm doing 3 jobs sort of thing means that paradoxically, just when they perhaps need to do some new rethinking, they're much less likely to do it.
Right, and one of the symptoms of that is that we withdraw into our own enclaves where everybody thinks the same. And this is something that a lot of us are doing a lot of hand-wringing about here in the States right now, because, for example, a lot of in fact, the vast majority of the people that I interact with in my personal life and in my professional life all think the same way. And we just assume that it's unthinkable that somebody like Donald Trump would be elected. And I know that there's just as many people in America who live in the heartland who think just the opposite, that for them the idea of electing somebody like Hillary Clinton was equally unthinkable. But we're not interacting with one another, so we don't realize that there are people who think so differently from us. If we had been able to get together, really get together, and have a meaningful dialogue, I think we would have been more enlightened about what some of the grievances were among Trump supporters and what some of the essential concerns are among Hillary Clinton supporters. But there was never a dialogue. Instead, one set of states in the country, mostly in the middle, voted one way, and those of us on the coast and on college and university campuses and other places like that, we all voted a different way. And there was never any real understanding about what the other side felt or wanted. Our messages just sort of, they missed each other like ships passing in the night.
I don't know if you've come across this idea that there are some deliberate uses of framing which are based around sowing confusion, so that people are never consistent, so you don't know what they're really thinking, but they're just pitching in different little snippets. It's been something that's been a tactic not of achieving something, but just disrupting the other group. Because this was something that came up in the political landscape over the last year, perhaps, that it didn't much matter if somebody was fairly incoherent, because that meant that they couldn't have, there was no real opposition to it which would allow a talking it through. You know what I mean? Because you never really know what position they were really adopting, because they would say one thing in the day and then tweet something else at night. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, and is that a deliberate, makes it even harder to get frames shifted, because there is a value sometimes in just disrupting the people with another view by making yourself incoherent, a bit like I'm getting at the moment, fairly incoherent.
Yeah, I think that there's an element of that. I think that is a sort of method of last resort, as I see it. I think the best method is to recognize that we all have a partial truth, and that it's only by beginning to come together with other people that we can begin to bring in alternative views. And it's not so much that we're aggregating partial truths, and that if we put together enough parts that we get a whole. I mean, that's one view of it, but I don't see it quite that way. The way I see it is that we can arrive at something together that we can't arrive at on our own. In other words, we can be more intelligent as a group than we can be individually. And so I am a big proponent of small group conversations around, I should say, structured small group conversations among people who view things differently, because I think there's a way that the collective intelligence of a group can really transcend individual differences. So when it comes to things like arriving at smarter ways to structure economic systems, for example, or smarter ways to begin to address climate change, how can groups come together to begin to transcend their polarized positions and instead talk about their common interests? And so this is one of the things that I've been working with organizations and leaders on doing as a consultant, is to see how can we move away from positions toward interests. It's a shift that we do away from talking about the solutions that we advocate to talking about what we care about the most. Because people can unite around their common interests, but they can't unite around polarized interests. Polarized positions.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Ken and Scott, for today's discussion. We've learned a lot about what framing is, how it is applied, and what the consequences are of frames and our frameworks. I want to thank you both for today. And if you are interested in the session about framing with George Lakoff last year, I already left a comment on the session page on the DIF website. And while you're there, please leave some feedback using the feedback button. Check out the schedule for more interesting sessions. Have a good day, everybody.